God's Existence, Truth or Fiction? The Answer Revealed, written by author Gary R. Lindberg, is a scientific study about the proof of God's existence. Lindberg examines scientific theories about the origin of life and the Bible's creation story. His approach is different, as he suggests that both science and the Bible say the same thing. Lindberg offers a powerful theory for readers to contemplate while presenting a unique conclusion. God's Existence, Truth or Fiction? The Answer Revealed is now available at your favorite online bookstore.
Welcome back to my discussion about my recent book, God's Existence, Truth or Fiction? The Answer Revealed. In the book, I take the reader on a journey with me as we explore evidence about the existence of God and find out whether or not there is sufficient proof to prove that he does exist. I compare this kind of like to a train trip that we take, for example, from San Francisco to New York, with stations along the way where we stop and contemplate the evidence that we are examining. And as we go through this, we've already begun our journey, and now we're at the 9th and very important stop or station, and we are going to examine the evidence here. So this chapter or station is titled Related Ideas Examined. Now, we've already studied and discussed scientific theories about the creation and the origins of life, and as well as the story of creation in the Bible. So last time we presented a powerful theory that is based on the concept that all life, that's human, animal, and plant life, are directed instead of being non-directed. As always, the aim of this exploration and examination is to determine whether or not God exists. So now I want to turn to consider some issues that humankind has raised to question the existence of God, or to even to deny his existence. So it's not my purpose to provide definitive answers to these issues, but to provoke some real thought and discussion as we discuss these issues. Some critics bring some of these issues up to deny the existence of God. So it's important to examine and evaluate some of them in regard to that kind of purpose. So we're going to examine 3 issues in particular. One is major calamities in history. 2, basic interpretations of creation. And 3, some inconsistencies in the Bible. So let's talk about the first issue, major calamities that occurred throughout history. And the first one I want to discuss is God created the Great Flood, as we all know, and advised Noah to build an ark so that he could gather the animals and his family in order to survive the basic flood. So when God did this, he promised to create a rainbow so that every time it rained, it would be a reminder to him, that is God, that he should not create any such massive flood again. So seeing the rainbow would be immediately a reminder to God of his promise, and so he could avoid a repetition of the great flood. Now, when God caused the flood, the writers of the Bible had a limited knowledge of the earth and how big it actually was. So when they wrote that the flood covered the earth, they did not really understand how limited the flood actually was. The flood did not cover all the continents and the entire face. It did cover a significant portion of the known world, but only that portion. When we read the Bible, the flood covered the known world, we need to understand that that statement was true to the extent of people's knowledge at that time. And in history, we've broadened our knowledge, and so our knowledge today is much broader, and so we can understand that the flood did not cover everything, every part of the earth. So that we can't assume that the description in the Bible described the literal truth of the flood. It was not quite fully accurate. Now, a second calamity that occurred was when God allowed the Hebrews to be enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years before he took action to, quote, free his people, unquote. Did God wait so long because he didn't care about what happened to the Hebrews? Or could it be possible that God had other issues or other intelligent beings to deal with in other parts of the universe? Could it be that God was distracted to other things that was happening on the earth besides what was happening on the earth? Would it be possible that other events or other matters had a higher priority that he needed to pay attention to more immediately? We should think about that. It would make more sense to analyze and evaluate God's actions based on his point of view and his sense of timing, instead of the humankind's point of view and the humankind's sense of timing. Doesn't that make sense? So after all, how can we, the created, judge the creator? Over and over again, humankind makes this mistake. Repeating that same mistake over a long period of time, even centuries, certainly does not solve the problem that we humans face. Now, centuries later, a third calamity occurred, the Nazi Holocaust. If God exists, why did he allow millions of people to be put to death in gas chambers during the Nazi Holocaust? That's a serious question. It's not the aim of my book to explain God's reasoning for his actions or lack of actions during the years the Nazis controlled Germany in the 20th century. Now, the Bible reminds us that humans' wisdom is, quote, foolishness in the sight of God. Doesn't it say that? Well, no human being can fully understand what God did or did not do, and why he did or why he did not do anything. Isn't that right? Since God surely looks at human events from a different perspective of eternity, unlike the human's perspective of a few hours or even days, we need to consider how God thought, how he acted. Now, God might have considered some factors that humans fail to understand. Doesn't that make sense? For example, God might not view human suffering for a relatively few years or even death in horrible gas chambers as terrible as, from his perspective, as humans would view it from our perspective. Perhaps God might view the joy of going to heaven for eternity, not a couple years, but for eternity, as more significant than short-term suffering that might quickly be forgotten. In other words, balancing all the years of eternity would weigh more heavily in God's perspective than a few moments or years of pain for humans. Now, a woman suffers pain during childbirth, but how much does she think about that pain in later years as the child grows up? Does she even remember it? Generally speaking, she probably doesn't think much about that pain. Does she? It might be the same with God, as he views people who suffer gas chambers or torture or even execution in various forms. Does during eternity, those people might not even remember that suffering, just like women don't think too much about their pain during pregnancy. Is that possible? God can any of us say that this cannot be true? Does anybody know God's mind? This point is raised to offer a different perspective. Now I want to start turning to other issues, the second category I mentioned. Of the three issues I want to discuss, the second is how people interpret creation and science. Dr. Jason Leasley had a unique point of view that deserves examination. He summarizes his creation, or his view of creation, I should say, by describing worldviews first. He asserts, quote, "First, everyone has presuppositions, basic beliefs that we take for granted before we begin to draw conclusions about the universe. These include things like the laws of logic and the reliability of our senses. All of our presuppositions taken together form our worldview. Our worldview determines how we interpret the facts and even what constitutes the facts," close quote. Now, Dr. Leasley goes on to say, most people are not even aware that they have a worldview and consequently haven't given it much thought to it. Well, if they haven't given it much thought, do they have a worldview? I have to ask that. Does that make sense to you? So anyway, Dr. Leasley asserts that one's worldview must be consistent. Well, that follows, and must follow certain rules that he lays out. According to Leasley, we must follow the three characteristics. These three characteristics are what he calls arbitrariness, inconsistency, and preconditions of intelligibility. He initializes that by AIP. In my book, I lay out the three characteristics and what they mean. So I don't want to get into it here, but it's not my purpose to discuss these three requirements or the criticisms that Leasley describes. Suffice it to say that Leasley criticizes environmentalists extensively on these 3 points. Well, while Leasley may conclude that everybody has a worldview, that conclusion doesn't necessarily make it a fact. Now, he argues that a worldview must be consistent. Well, I can see that. But since all Christians don't believe in, quote, one Christian, unquote, worldview, I think that violates the requirement that Leasley specifies. Now, it's true that all Christians have various beliefs, biases, and knowledge in common, but all Christians do not have all the same beliefs, biases, and knowledge. Even their theology varies because there are numerous Christian denominations. Now, one denomination, for example, believes that communion represents the actual body and blood of Christ. Others believe that the communion represents the symbol of the body and blood of Christ. Not the same. Some Christians believe they should use grape juice instead of as a symbol of Christ's blood. Some Christians believe in the adoration of Mary, the mother of Jesus, while other Christians abhor such adoration. Some Christians believe they should not eat meat on Friday, while others have no such belief. Because there are numerous denominations that call themselves Christians, there are numerous differences in some of their beliefs. Evolutionists, likewise, have various basic beliefs, biases, and knowledge. Leasley points out that some evolutionists believe in naturalism. That's a belief that nature is all there is. It's only nature. Other evolutionists believe in empiricism. That's a belief that all knowledge is gained from observations. Observations is where it's at. A similar variety of thinking exists among other people, including people of different religions and those scientists who live in different parts of the world. I dare say there are probably as many beliefs, biases, and knowledge as there are people on the earth. That also means that there are likewise many worldviews, if we accept Leasley's point of view that people have worldviews. This means that every person is a different collection of beliefs, prejudices, assumptions, and knowledge. Now, this does not mean that there can't be common beliefs among groups of people. Indeed, that occurs, for sure. Nevertheless, I suggest there is not enough consensus and consistency among Christians or other groups, as Leasley insists on, to justify calling their beliefs a, quote, Christian worldview. So the bottom line is a Christian worldview is not a monolithic or necessarily widely held view among all Christians, let alone among other groups of people. Now, another question that Dr. Leasley brings up is the question of ultimate standard. He categorizes, or he categorically says that creationists, quote, embrace the Bible as our ultimate standard. The Bible is the ultimate standard, he says. He blatantly claims the ultimate proof of creation is this: if biblical creation were not true, we could not know anything. If it's not true, we can't know it. Anything. He continues to say, this proof can be stated in a number of different ways. But what it really comes down to is this: only the Christian worldview, starting with the literal Genesis, can rationally make sense of the universe. Only if biblical creation is true can we have a genuine knowledge about anything. Otherwise, people's views are irrational. So that means if you're not a Christian, you're irrational? He directly says the Bible must be the ultimate standard because no other standard can make knowledge possible. So does that mean that the Egyptians, when they built their pyramids, had no knowledge? They weren't rational? Does it mean that the Incas and their building their civilization in pyramids were not rational and had no knowledge? Does that mean the Aztecs had no knowledge? Did the Japanese civilizations, they had no knowledge? All the dynasties in China, they had no knowledge? They were irrational? To me, this is so preposterous that it must be rejected as false. Now, I think it's about time for us to take a break, and we'll take a short commercial break, and we'll be right back.
The vegetable grows and the lion roars. Read about the work and life of Peace Corps volunteer Gary R. Lindbergh in the early days of this program in Ivory Coast, Africa. Learn about his adventures and travels to places like Nigeria, Mali, and more. Join his excitement as he witnessed the lions, leopards, and other wild animals as they roamed across the plains of East Africa. It's all there for your enjoyment. The vegetable grows and the lion roars. Available now on Amazon. Get your copy today.
God's Existence, Truth or Fiction? The Answer Revealed, written by author Gary R. Lindbergh, is a scientific study about the proof of God's existence. Lindbergh examines scientific theories about the origin of life and the Bible's creation story. His approach is different, as he suggests that both science and the Bible say the same thing. Lindbergh offers a powerful theory for readers to contemplate while presenting a unique conclusion. God's Existence, Truth or Fiction? The Answer Revealed is now available at your favorite online bookstore.
Welcome back, everybody. Let's continue our discussion. I've talked about three basic issues. One is the major calamities in history. Two, we talked about basic ideas of about creation and science. And thirdly, now I want to talk about one of the issues, which is the discrepancies in the Bible. We know that the Bible was written and developed during the first 4 centuries after Christ. This was a way for the early Christians to create a unified Christian message to attract more followers. And numerous sects, like, for example, the Essenes or the Agnostics, or the Gnostics, I should say, and many other emerging sects propagated their own version of religious thought that competed with the Christian, Jewish, and pagan ways of thinking. However, over the years, people became aware of numerous contradictions between the 4 Gospels, which became, of course, the foundation of Christianity and part of the New Testament. As we know, the 4 Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, excuse me. They tell us about the work and life of Jesus Christ. Now, according to the Bible, according to the critics, each gospel contains a mix of fact, rumor, legend, and myth that have gone through numerous translations, edits, and redactions. So, over the years, of course, the Bible has been translated many times and through in many languages, and it's been a little bit changed over the years. But while the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, the New Testament was written in Greek. So there's 2 languages that have to be translated. Now, Matthew and Luke recounted the temptation of Christ in the wilderness. But Jesus was alone when that happened. It's also true of Jesus when he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. Luke wrote that Jesus offered his prayer in Gethsemane, quote, a stone's throw away from the rest of the disciples. When Jesus finished his prayer and returned to be with the disciples, he found that the disciples were all asleep. Jesus was promptly arrested and then led away for his crucifixion. There's no mention of Jesus ever saying a word to explain his prayer in the garden or the temptation in the wilderness. How do we know all about those 2 events? One logical answer is that the gospel is not a word-by-word description of the events before, during, or after. It would have been a simple matter for Jesus to tell his disciples all about the 2 events. It is simply not recorded in the Bible that he told anybody. Now, how is that not obvious? Or else there was a witness, but that was not recorded either. Well, a third possibility is that God put the thought into the mind of the writer of the gospel. Well, that's certainly possible. Well, another complaint that they have is that all four gospels describe the disciples fleeing when Jesus was arrested. So if the disciples and the writers of the four gospels were not there, how can the gospels provide a detailed account of the crucifixion? We do know that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was in fact there at the crucifixion. Perhaps some of the disciples were too. If Jesus was resurrected, he too could have described what happened. Since we don't know and don't have possession of actual transcripts or movies of his appearances before the disciples, how can we summarily dismiss such possibilities? We know, and when we think about things today, we know smart people will tell us that some individuals will succeed in life while others believe they will fail. But both groups are right. Our way of thinking has a tendency to produce the way we choose to believe, the result we choose to believe. It produces the result we choose to believe. That same phenomenon exists when we discuss the New Testament. Now, the greatest inconsistencies, some critics say, exist in the four Gospels' description of the crucifixion. The Gospels even disagree on the date. John said it was the day before Passover, while the other three asserted it was the day after. Now, if you're going to be literal and interpreting the Bible, how do you account for that discrepancy in time? You have to say it's not literal. It's the best recollection those people had. Now, supposedly, even Jesus' final words varied among the Bibles or Gospels. Matthew and Mark claimed his last words were, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Luke wrote, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And John simply offered, "It is finished." Not exactly a variation on the same words, is it? These gospel writers wrote their four gospels over a period of 400 years. Is it possible that each emphasized points that they thought were important? Since, again, no transcripts were made, is it possible that Jesus spoke all of those final words? I suggest that that might be the case. Now, let's try an experiment. If we line up 10 people in a row, in one row, and whisper something into the ear of the first person at the end of the row, after which each person in turn would whisper to the person on their right or left, whichever direction we're going, until everybody in the row heard the message and then gave it to the next person. What would the last person in the row announce that he or she heard? We know from actual life today that the final message would be totally different than the original message offered by the first person in the row. Have you ever had that happen, or have you ever seen that happen? Well, another example is if we heard the testimony of 4 or 6 witnesses, for example, standing on the 4 corners of an intersection as they witnessed a car accident involving 2 cars. Now, every key witness would tell a slightly different story about what happened. Every person would remember different details, not the same details. The same phenomenon would have occurred to the witnesses of Jesus being crucified. Everybody has a different perspective. of what they see and hear. So it's very clear that we simply have different perceptions, but are not, nobody really ends up having the full accurate perception of what happened. On top of all this, how do stories change when they're retold and retold and retold, generation after generation after generation, until the stories are written down? When some people want to believe the Bible is the literal truth, are they being honest or are they being foolish? Remember, Jesus said, "Seek ye the truth, and it will set you free." Seek ye the truth, and it will set you free. Is God afraid of the truth? Absolutely not. Why are we afraid? In spite of all the variations and inconsistencies in the Bible itself says that the Bible can be used for reproof and correction. So the Bible is not worrying about a lot of details, and the writers weren't worrying about a lot of details, but it is good enough to offer reproof and correction. And what are they reproving and correcting? I suggest that reproving and correcting our behavior. Probably not too much to argue about in details of history, but the whole Bible, it starts from the 10 Commandments throughout to talk about our behavior. When the disciples asked Jesus, "What is the greatest commandment?" Jesus responded by saying, I'll paraphrase, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor, thou shalt love God with all thy heart, mind, and soul, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So it's all about behavior, I suggest. So we finished talking about the three events that were calamities in history, some basic interpretations of creation and science, and finally, inconsistencies in the Bible that critics bring up when discussing the Bible. Now that we've examined a lot of evidence, what can we conclude from this research? We will discuss that next time. Until then, I wish you the best of health and safety in this troubled world.
God's Existence, Truth or Fiction? The Answer Revealed, written by author Gary R. Lindberg, is a scientific study about the proof of God's existence. Lindberg examines scientific theories about the origin of life and the Bible's creation story. His approach is different, as he suggests that both science and the Bible say the same thing. Lindberg offers a powerful theory for readers to contemplate while presenting a unique conclusion. God's Existence, Truth or Fiction? The Answer Revealed is now available at your favorite online bookstore.
The vegetable grows and the lion roars. Read about the work and life of Peace Corps volunteer Gary R. Lindberg in the early days of this program in Ivory Coast, Africa. Learn about his adventures and travels to places like Nigeria, Mali, and more. Join his excitement as he witnessed the lions, leopards, and other wild animals as they roamed across the plains of East Africa. It's all there for your enjoyment. The vegetable grows and the lion roars. Available now on Amazon. Get your copy today.